went and, well, actually, then I did an internship at the Reserve Bank. So I thought I was kind of wrestling, do I want to be an economist? Do I want to go into academia and so on? So I did a short internship at the Reserve Bank, thought about public service, which is, the Australian version of the Federal Reserve. And ultimately decided that neither academia or being an economist was the right thing for me for a range of different reasons, and ended up finishing my law degree and then interning at Goldman Sachs in investment banking. And so I then joined Goldman Sachs as initially in the telecommunications, media, and technology group, doing M&A advisory and helping raise equity and debt and those types of things. And then pretty soon after that, the financial crisis hit. And so I went into financial sponsors, so advising private equity clients. And then I went to New York. And when I was in New York, still at Goldman, I got appointed to an internal committee. So looking at things like culture and attrition and these types of questions. And it was through that I kind of got exposed to, I guess, thinking about a bunch of the issues that people in the people analytics world think about, right? But including thinking about the organization as a network. And I realized that there wasn't really a tool that existed that made that kind of analysis accessible to people. And you didn't need a PhD to use. And so I ended up resigning from Goldman and moving back to Australia. And that was really the genesis for Polinode.
Well, that's a great lead in, because the next question I was going to ask you is, what exactly is Polinode? What do you do? How did it come about? You're the founder and CEO of Polinode. Why? Why did you found it? What is it? What is the goal with Polinode?
Yeah, so I might start with kind of what is organizational network analysis. So
even better.
Because Polinode is a tool for organizational network analysis. So organizational network analysis is kind of, at its heart, it's all about informal relationships, as opposed to the formal hierarchical relationships that people are often used to thinking about or looking at in terms of reporting relationships. But what we're really interested in is who are you really working with? You might not be somebody that you report with, it might not be somebody in the team, but who are your actual kind of working relationships. And so Polinode is a tool for collecting, visualizing, and analyzing everything to do with those informal relationships and helping you kind of understand it. And I think there's an important question there, which is the how question. How do you do it? People often ask, where does the data come from? Mm-hmm. And there's two sides. There's two types of organizational network analysis, really. There's the passive organizational network analysis, and there's what's called active organizational network analysis. And the passive organizational network analysis is where you plug into the digital exhaustive organizations. So you can think about like email data, calendar data, Slack data, Teams data, anything to do around the communication, how people are communicating, so digital data. And importantly, we only touch the metadata, so we don't touch the content on the passive side.
So metadata, meaning you only look at like who sent what at what time, but you don't read what was sent across there, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Just enough for us to map the network. So that's the passive side. And then the active side is where you ask people questions about their relationships. So you ask people questions like, who do you work with often? At its most basic level, you're seeking to map the working relationships. And who do you go to for advice? And who's a source of knowledge for you? Energy, innovation, right? Who's a mentor? So there's lots of different types of networks within an organization. And so just by asking people those questions, we can map that network data.
Have you ever had any like potential customer think that you were mapping like romantic relationships?
Yeah, I mean,
do they ever
absolutely.
think that?
Well, not on the active side because of the questions that we're asking, right? We're not specifically asking about romantic relationships, but I mean, that question does come up on the passive side, which is, will this not expose people who are in a relationship that, might not necessarily, want
Oh
that?
yeah, good point.
Yeah, in terms of the email communication. The reality is, I mean, generally the people that are doing the analysis, right, you're looking at things like overall centrality, community detection, and so on, right? And it's not really something that comes up practically. But I mean, it goes to the privacy question, of course. Obviously, it's generally a small group of analysts that have access to that data, and in the same way that you would treat engagement data confidentially, you treat that confidentially too.
Yeah. Well, before we go to that though, I do want to go back. What led to you even deciding that this was worth coming? So this whole network analysis thing, I mean, it is a fun statistical approach and you had a lot of the statistical kind of background, but what led you to thinking that Polinode, the company as it is today, needed to exist?
Yeah, well, what led me to resign from investment banking and completely changing my career, right? And going down this path. Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think that organizations can be complicated and bureaucratic and not always the best places to work for people, right? They can be cold and, they can be difficult sometimes, right? And the fundamental, idea behind Polinode, and I think organizational network analysis generally, but for me, the reason why I chose this path was to make organizations a better place for people to work in. And I think that's what drives a lot of people in the people analytics space. It's this really interesting intersection of people, right, and data. And I think a lot of people who are in the people analytics space fundamentally care about the experience that people have, particularly in the workplace.
Yeah, I think that's such a great statement. I mean, I know that's kind of, I've always had a thing around equity, and I've always believed that people analytics can offer so many opportunities for ensuring equal and equitable opportunities to really important things like healthy work environments and job opportunities. And yeah, it's so great. For those who are, watching either live or recording, I'd love to know if that's true for you as well. Are you into people analytics because you believe you can make the work world better, like Andrew and myself? It would be great to see that. So then, with Polinode, there's that ability to do people data for good, and ideally not be totally creepy about it when you do. But how do you think that this type of analysis or people analytics can be used to make a more just world or a more positive world or a better place to be, and specifically on the doing good, not just the don't be creepy part? I'll actually ask you that as soon as you're done telling me what the good things are. But first, like, can it make good happen? Like, what would that look like? What are your thoughts on O&A or people analytics to make the work world better?
Yeah. So I mean, absolutely. But I think there's kind of, let me address the question in two ways, right? So definitely in the work world, and maybe it makes sense to talk a little bit about some of the use cases there and kind of how that makes things better. But then I think there's also broader applications as well, particularly in like the not-for-profit space and things like that, which I think when you think about the potential for organizational network analysis to do good, that's an important point as well. So it's but if we can talk about the work world to start off with, so I mean, it's things like mapping collaboration, right? And helping understand where there are silos. Because if you think about frustrations that people might have in workplaces, right? What kinds of things do they stem from? It's often from, different groups having different mentalities or being siloed, right? It can be also things like overload, right? So people that might be, under particular strain, but others not realizing that, right? And that's, networks can yield a lot of insight on, questions around overload as well.
Yeah, because there's difference in overload, meaning a lot of tasks are given to you, but some people get a lot of tasks without any interruptions or requests for help or information from others, while others get the same workload, but a much more involved, network that they're responding to, that I guess there's actually additional workload that could come with additional connections. So it's interesting because you also don't want to be isolated, but you also need to appreciate that connection does take time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, relationships have a cost, right? So more relationships doesn't always necessarily mean better.
Yeah.
And so, often I think when people are first introduced to organizational network analysis, it's well, this means I must grow my network, but no, it's not necessarily the case, right? So it's important to kind of acknowledge that as well.
Yeah, the quality over quantity discussion. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's a whole range of other use cases as well. So one of the challenges is often to explain the variety of use cases. So it's things like succession planning as well, things like diversity and inclusion. Another one, when we think about its potential for good, right, is finding talent that might be flying under the radar as well. So particularly management doesn't necessarily have visibility a couple of layers down. And so, finding that kind of hidden or emerging talent, I think there's a lot of potential for good there as well. And then that intersects with the diversity and inclusion use case, because often some of that hidden talent might be more diverse talent as well.
Yeah.
So a whole lot of kind of different, I think, very beneficial and positive use cases and ways of using organizational network analysis within organizations. But if you let me, I'll talk about a couple of the non-organizational ones as well.
Actually, I'd love to hear that.
That's really interesting too. So, like not-for-profit use cases, I always find really interesting because, within an organization, you often have competitors, right? And so you are mapping the internal relationships, but not-for-profits generally, they operate in a different environment. And so there's a lot of external mapping of relationships and collaboration. So, a good example there is, a large not-for-profit in Europe used Polinode, not at the individual person-to-person level, but mapping different not-for-profit entities that were collaborating around sustainability with each other, and what the different communities were there, and which organizations wanted more access to other organizations, and kind of helping facilitate those introductions and making that network of organizations more effective and more efficient. And then if you think about, I guess, something more at the individual level, so another not-for-profit used Polinode to collect data on household relationships after a cyclone in the Philippines. And they used that then to inform, basically they got each household that was going to then be part of a shelter to nominate up to 10 other households that they wanted to be close to.
Oh,
that's a natural network, right? And so you can use the network layout and community detection to inform where to position the different parts of the shelter structure.
Yeah.
So,
do you think that this approach could be used for identifying wrongdoer connections? I mean, I can't help but think, could you not, maybe not through active means, but could you not potentially use passive ones to identify, organizations and groups that are damaging society, and maybe be able to identify them? I know we're getting into, political and legal world when I ask that, but do you think that's something that it could be used for?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. So I think that if I can take it to the organizational question, sometimes people have central positions in an organization because they might have placed themselves there for political reasons, right? Or sometimes their position might be like a roadblock, right? A blockage in terms of the structure, right? And it's not always that they're deliberately seeking to do damage, but that can lead to problems in the overall network, right? And that's why, like, the context in the organization, when you're looking at it, to not always just focus purely on the metrics, but also kind of drill in and ask the right questions and dig in and kind of understand it is really important. So yes, I think, there's definitely that potential. But yeah, not in an automated fashion, I think with an appropriate context and discovery by the analyst. Yeah.
Well, and the context is key. And, whether, and maybe this takes it somewhat back to organizational network analysis, but just because I'm thinking from the people analytics space, I mean, there is a bit of a creepy factor when we talk about, relationships and connections. I know that when I talk about organizational network analysis, there's always questions like, oh, but you don't know if these are real connections and real conversations, or, are they thoughtful interactions, especially when you just look at the metadata. So when you don't read the content of an email, which is good, we shouldn't, but you might be inferring different things. But so there's this mix of it's a little more nuanced, and also it's creepy. Like, you are trying to take my relationship, which you can't possibly understand from metadata alone, and you're trying to explain my relationships with others. And so I know people find it a bit sensitive, that there's some privacy issues of assessing social interactions. How do you think about an approach, the nuance of trying to understand interactions, and also that creepy factor of taking relationships and boiling them into graphs, basically, and nodes and things like that?
Yeah. So firstly, I would say on the nuance point, I agree. So I think human relationships are incredibly complicated and nuanced, right? And it is, one of the disadvantages of passive organizational network analysis in particular is that you can't really capture that. You're capturing the frequency of communication, but I don't know that I'm emailing you because, I need, more stationary versus it's an important strategic relationship for me, right? So yes, you don't get that kind of nuance from the communication alone, right? But you still get a lot of other valuable information from that relationship data. And on the active side, that's one of the advantages of the active data, right? Is that you can ask people about mentorship. You can ask people about who you find it easy to initiate a conversation with, and so on. And one of the most interesting areas at the moment within organizational network analysis is the combination of the two data sets, because then you get the best of both worlds, right? Because you get the nuanced side in terms of the active, but then you also get the advantages of passive, which is you get more data, you get a higher frequency of data, so you can look at changes over kind of a couple of weeks or a couple of months or so on, right? And it also enables a lot of other types of analysis. So I agree on the nuance. Now the creepy part. So I think that's particularly around the passive data. I think people tend to be a lot more comfortable with the active data because I'm giving positive consent, participating, and of course, I think there are really important privacy considerations around active data as well. So you obviously need to make people aware, who's going to have access to the data and what it's going to be used for, and to do the right and responsible things around that too. But I think the big brother or the creepy factor is often around the passive, right? And on that side of things, the answer is not simple, and the answer varies, right? And it might not be appropriate to use passive data with some companies in some locations with some cultures, right? Because there might not be the level of trust, or it might not be appropriate. And so often it depends on the culture of the organization, right? And then it's not really binary, do we do it or do we not do it, right? There are ways of doing that can be sensitive to privacy constraints.
You mean like aggregation, or what do you mean with that?
Anonymization is one. So again, it's a bit of a trade-off, right? Because if you anonymize it, you have less detail, right? So you get less insight, but sometimes anonymization is the right answer in some situations, right? So, Polinode includes the option to anonymize all the data at the point of ingestion, right? But it's an option. It's not, this is what you have to do. It depends on the situation. And then, we hash emails, right? So it's a one-way anonymization. And then sometimes the answer is opt-in, right? So this is another interesting area of combining active and passive, where you can collect active with positive opt-in, and then as part of that, you give people the informed, decision to participate in the passive, where it's opt-in as well.
Yeah, and I've got to add in, though, it has to be good opt-in, meaning none of this hidden language where nobody understands what they're opting into. It needs to be clear and explicit what the data would be used for. And then, that's more my speed.
Yeah, absolutely. So informed consent, right? What's going to be collected, who's going to have access to it, and importantly, what it's going to be used for, right? Absolutely. Yeah. Because, going back to the point around good, right? Most people, when they understand some of the applications around diversity and inclusion, onboarding of diverse talent and those types of applications, right? I think are supportive of it, but it needs to be informed consent, and also there's also what I call like the front page of the newspaper test, right? Yeah. So if your usage of organizational network analysis was on the front page of the newspaper, would you feel comfortable with that, right? And if you're comfortable with it, then it's not going to be on the front page of the newspaper.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And it's funny, in the comments, we've got Chad Mitchell also just commenting about the fact that you can have changes in behavior just when people know they're being watched, though. So that too can change it. But you hit on a question that I have. And also for those who are watching, please feel free, put questions in the chat. I can see that coming up and be happy to answer them. But you just mentioned inclusion, which huge interest area for me, because how do you measure inclusion? We all know when we feel excluded, but how do you really measure inclusion? It can't possibly just be the absence of being excluded. And there's, the analogies that people like to use of, there's a difference between being invited and, being interacted with. But I feel like there is an opportunity for these kind of analyses to potentially offer a better measure for inclusion. Best measure? No, but I think that might be a pipe dream, but a better measure. Do you use it that way? How have you seen it for being able to better understand whether or not a company has an inclusive environment, or even any form of grouping, whether that be a social group, a nonprofit, a government, any kind of group of humans?
Yeah, so I think one of the most interesting questions there is often within a company, are there parts of our organization that might be less inclusive than other parts of the organization? And there's a range of different things that you can do kind of to understand that. One of the most basic is just looking at a collaboration matrix, right? So if you take gender as an example, look at male and female collaboration, and then, you know, controlling for size. And often we also want to control for seniority as well, because often in companies, not always, but often more senior people skew more male, and people will often, particularly in active M&As, nominate people that are more senior than themselves. But if we look at a collaboration matrix, we can see, you know, what proportion of connections from men are going to other men and then to females, and then how does that compare to the relative size, and then the same with you know, females to males and females to females, right? So that can be really interesting, and then to drill into different groups in that way as well. We can also look at regression analysis, right? So looking at, you know, again, nominations and controlling for seniority, controlling for tenure as well, because tenure can be really important, and then including gender as an explanatory variable as an example, or ethnicity and race as well, and see to what extent is you know, are those significant or not, and are there some variations if you've got a large enough sample size within the organization. So there's you know definitely things like that, I guess, from a more measurement standpoint. But if we can take a step back as well and just think about like diversity and inclusion, because I often think of, you know, the diversity and inclusion question as being fundamentally related to networks, because you know, in networks there's this concept around homophily, right, which is that people tend to connect with people that are the same as them. So males tend to connect with males, and so on, right? And so I actually think that, yes, I think organizational network analysis has a lot to give in the D&I space, but also fundamentally the persistence of, I guess, you know, less equitable structures has a lot to do with networks and the persistence of networks over time, if that makes sense. So,
yeah. Do you think that just the showing of those kind of closed off networks can be helpful? I mean, they do say that what gets measured gets managed. So I think that even though it might not sound like a solve, I think being able to identify and show that particular networks are less inclusive than others could at least maybe help to motivate some individuals to address it. You know, one thing I've thought about with the networks as well is I've heard and seen others who've done analyses that the promotion pipeline tends to do not just with like mentorship and not even sponsorship necessarily, but in having an active role on key work projects that matter. And so I've often thought about how potentially you could use this type of analysis to identify where you might have high potential, underutilized resources who just aren't connected with, you know, the function or the teams that are working on the types of projects that are critical to their progression in their career. And so ideally being able to show the teams and the groupings where you could place someone could help to really increase the promotional opportunities through just good work projects, not forced relationships, not forced anything, just opportunities. That's been something I've been hoping to start to see people use it a bit more for.
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think to your point on just showing people can actually have a really positive change. Absolutely. And so one of the ways that we do that from a D&I perspective is individual network reports. And so showing people where they sit in the network, you know, how insular or diverse their personal network is. But also what's really important there too is the proportion of their connections that are to people that are more senior than them, also the same level as them, and more junior to them. And where I've seen people use that really effectively from a D&I standpoint is giving, you know, those diverse populations access to that data, and then showing them particularly that split and having them think about their, in particular, connection to people that are more senior than them, because that goes to the opportunity and the exposure for mentorship, for projects, for promotion and promotability as well. Where I haven't seen people do that as well, but I think there's an enormous amount of potential, is on the flip side of that. So to show people that are more senior in the organization, their networks, and particularly those people that view them as formal and informal mentors, and how, you know, diverse or non-diverse that population is for them, to get them to think about that, right? Absolutely.
Well, and I think we all sometimes wonder, especially at certain leadership levels in certain types of companies, you know, some leaders you only ever see talking to other leaders, and it makes you, you know, wonder what their connection is to other individuals in the organization. Because if you're in the C-suite and you refuse to talk to anyone who isn't in the C-suite, you know, how well do you actually understand what goes on in the organization? Or are you only getting filtered information? So I have always been interested in the ability to use something like this to help leaders understand if they are or are not very well connected with the broader organization to which they're speaking for. Because I would argue that if you're not connected with anyone at a different level of the organization than you, then how can you really speak for or about, you know, all those other employees? And I've always thought this was a good opportunity to potentially shine some light on particular leadership styles. And, you know, I'll ask you one question, because Jesse K. Powell in the comments here, and we have a few more minutes, so if others are watching, you have a question, please send it in. There was a comment about, is this maybe not a good technique to use if it's a bureaucratic culture?
Well, it's an interesting question. So I think it depends on what you want the culture to be, you know. So if the organization doesn't, if they feel like they're very much a bureaucratic kind of institution, and they want to change and be less bureaucratic and kind of more agile, right? Then an awareness of the networks and perhaps, you know, breaking down silos through that awareness can be really helpful. So I would say, particularly if that's a suboptimal way of working, then I think organizational network analysis probably has a lot to give. Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure the comment has a little to do with, well, you know, once there's already a structure expected for how work gets done, how does it tie over? Yeah. Yeah. And Chad is just commenting more on the C-suite executive piece around, you know, there could be other people that executives might, you know, maybe should be talking to increase effectiveness and the connections there.
I think there's also a really interesting point that, again, is probably on more of the call it the cutting edge of organizational network analysis, that goes to the intersection of the formal and informal, right? So like, how can you use the informal structure to inform the formal structure, right? So if you feel like the organization should be less kind of command and control and more agile, right, then you can make changes to the formal structure that's informed by that informal structure.
Yeah, almost like if you would not like to have a hierarchical structure and you see hierarchies or silos beginning to form, you could actually consciously change that. Yeah, and I know that I've seen some good examples too, where the goal is to break up silos and to try to ensure more connections across networks. And so you can take key connectors and strategically connect them across groups that can really bring about communication, teamwork, efficiency, where previously there had been silos. And from the few experiences that I've seen, it's actually taken very little movement. I mean, you know, a couple promotions of a couple key people, and voila, the networks have started to talk. It's almost magical sometimes when you've seen it happen.
Yep, absolutely.
So we're getting a different Chad here. We are very popular with Chads on this live stream, commenting on an Elon Musk quote saying, communication should travel via the shortest path necessary to get the job done, not through the chain of command. So yeah, definitely good one. To that effect, so we are right at the end. We have one more question. So how about I ask you this one, and then we start to close it off. So Misael is asking, have you seen cultural norms like power distance and things of that affect the attributes of networks that are happening within a company?
Cultural norms. So can you talk a little bit more about that? So
I think the question probably has more to do with the fact that in certain societies or cultures, you might see different power balances and interaction styles.
Definitely. Yeah, like different cultures definitely have different networks and different ways of working together. So, I mean, to give you a concrete example of that, one of the questions that we often ask is around greater access. So who do you need more access to? And we will find that there is, particularly in China, a much greater proportion in terms of people indicating that they want more access to other people than in, for example, the US. So there's definitely different ways of working and different ways of thinking about networks in different cultures.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you. Well, I know we are right at time. We've had some nice people participating live. This will also be recorded for later as well. But thank you so much for partnering with me on my classes where we've brought O&A in, for sharing your story. Any closing comment?
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Heather. Always enjoy the conversation. And I think, part of what you say around the privacy and the those important questions that you ask, part of the answer to that as well is awareness and education as well. Yeah. So I think what you do is an important part of that. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yes, people data, but people data for good, and only when it's for good. Always got to be a little careful. But thank you. Thanks so much for joining, and thank you for everyone who watched live, and for all of those who catch it later. It's nice to see you.